My name is Chris Stone, and this is the first of what I hope will be dozens of events at the new headquarters of the Open Society Foundations. It is a pleasure to have Moises Naim with us today to talk about the end of power and other associated topics. In addition to being a member of the board of the Open Society Foundations, Moises is Senior Associate in International Economics in the International Economics Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Before that, for 14 years, was the acclaimed editor of Foreign Policy, taking that magazine to all sorts of new heights. He spent some time as Venezuela's Minister of Trade and Industry in the early 90s, and might, if we have nothing more to say about power before the end of the afternoon, might offer a few comments on Venezuela. And he is a recipient of many prizes, including probably the most prestigious award in Spanish journalism, the Ortega y Gasset Prize. He is the chief international columnist at El País, the largest newspaper in Spain, and many more things. He's also just a very good friend of the Open Society Foundations and a good friend of Open Society more generally. I first learned of Moises with a book closer to my area of work, Illicit, which is, if you haven't seen, I recommend to you. But actually, while this isn't my area, it's probably the topic I find most compelling these days, which is power. And in this case, Moises's theories and prescriptions about what to do about the end of power and how power is changing in the world. In the book, which some of you I know have already devoured, but in case others of you have not gotten all the way through it, in the opening of the book, he talks about how human life, of course, does not boil down to power alone. Surely love, sex, faith, and other urges and emotions also have their part to play, but just as surely, power is a quest that has forever motivated people, and just as it has always done, power structures society and helps govern relationships and orchestrate the interactions between people and within and among communities and nations. Power plays out in every field in which we contend, compete, or organize. Arguably, power also plays out in our most intimate love and family relations, as well as in our language and even through our dreams. Though those last dimensions are beyond the focus of this book.
For now.
But that does not mean they're beyond the focus of today's conversation. It does not mean that they have been insulated from the trends I seek to explain. We're going to have a conversation here, and then in a bit open it up and invite you to join with questions or comments yourselves. I thought that, but it might be good to begin by simply, Moises, just say a little bit about what is happening to power in your view, and how did this book begin?
Well, let me first start by thanking you, Chris. Thank you all for being here in this difficult weather-wise day, and I'm very proud of my association with the Open Society Foundation, and delighted that I am the first to start this series of conversations in the new facilities. So thank you very much. What's happening to power is, some of it is well known. We know that power is shifting. We know that it's shifting from east to west, and from presidential palaces to public squares, and for big companies to startups. Recently, Kodak, that used to be the dominant player in photography, almost a monopoly, went down and was bankrupt. And at the same time, by coincidence, that called my attention, an app called Instagram was sold for $1 billion. Total number of employees at Instagram, 13. So when you start thinking about these kinds of events, you know that, yes, power is shifting in very fundamental ways, in politics, in religion, in culture, in philanthropy. and of course in geopolitics and matters of war and peace and everything else. So power is shifting. But what the big idea in the book, the central theme is that power is not just shifting. Power is also changing in fundamental ways. Power is decaying. And by that I mean that power now is easier to get, much harder to use, and it's more fleeting. It's, you can lose it much faster in all of the realms of human activity.
Maybe can you give us a few concrete examples of what you mean?
The book is organized by chapters about a variety of sectors, you know, the military and business and the media and culture and, of course, national politics and geopolitics. One compelling, and each one is, I was very aware that I was writing a book about a subject that has been very well treated for centuries. And so my only hope of making a statement that was a bit different is to make sure that the theme was grounded on data and statistics and evidence and not just opinion. In the chapter on the military, for example, there is what I find a fascinating example, which is a study by a scholar called Ivana Regin-Toft, who studied asymmetrical armed conflicts. Meaning that it pitted a weak side against a strong side, measured by weapons and number of the size of the troops and all of the typical military metrics that you use to gauge power. And so between 1850 to 1949, the weak part won armed conflicts 12% of the time. From 1950 to 1998, the weak party won 55% of the time. So today, in today's conflicts, seems to be that statistically, it's more likely that the weak side is more likely to win. Then, you know, I was also very aware that I was making these bold statements about the decay of power at a time in which inequality in the world is growing, in which we have this very large wealth being concentrated in few hands, the 99% being energized against the concentration of power and wealth in the 1%. So I am aware of that. But then I started looking at what was happening in the world of the wealthy and in the world of corporate wealth and corporate power. And there is another fascinating study that shows that if you, a company that was in the top 20% of its sector in 1980 had only a 20% probability of falling out of that tier 5 years hence. That probability now has doubled. So the probability that if you are at the top of your league and that you get ousted or displaced by another is now doubled. The probability that you are a CEO of a large American company and you get fired has also doubled since the 1990 to today. So
it's probably true for foundations as well.
And let's say that some more than others. And so essentially the story is one that it's slippery at the top. In religion, in many countries in Africa, Latin America, 20 years ago, most people would identify themselves, especially in Latin America, as Catholics. Now that number has dwindled. One example is Brazil. Brazil in 1970, 90% of the country called themselves Catholic. In the 2010 census, it's 65%. And we're seeing that everywhere. The number of philanthropy, just imagine in your world, in the world of philanthropy, 20, 30 years ago. Well, the big players, you knew who they were. There's a limited number of foundations. It was the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller and a few others that were essentially the dominant players, with a lot of other smaller ones. Now you have witnessed an explosion of activities in the non-profit, in the charity world, and in philanthropy. And the same is happening in labor unions. The same is happening in a variety of ways. So the point in the book, the central message is, show me one human activity And I will show you how those that are in power have less power than they had before. That doesn't mean that they're not powerful. They're very powerful people in the world today. And Vladimir Putin continues to be very powerful, and the President of the United States also, as is the Pope, and is head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Pentagon. My point is that all of these people, including the President of China, has less power than the people that were in that position 10, 20 years ago.
So why? Why would actually the examples in the book go beyond even what we think of as, you talk about chess champions, you talk about a whole range of sort of fascinating things. So we could go on with the examples, I think, well beyond the corporation and governments. But let's get to why. Why is this happening? Why power has shifted for ages, but the claim that power is decaying and changing, why is it happening?
The first instinct when that very good question is asked is the internet. So the internet and social media more recently, that is changing everything. And I, of course, agree with that, except that I think that's a very limited way of understanding it. I think the internet and social media are tools, and tools need users, and those users have motivation and direction. So it's not enough. What happened in the Arab Spring cannot be explained by the widespread proliferation of social media. Of course, they played a role. But far more important than that was, in the case of Tunisia, for example, was the huge expansion of the middle class in Tunisia. A middle class that was able to bring their sons and daughters to university, to have a significant increase in education, information, aspiration, expectations, and all kinds of things that were frustrated by a government that was not delivering, except for the small but important detail that Tunisia has the best performing economy in North Africa. Tunisia had the highest rate of economic growth, had the biggest expansion of educational opportunities and educational attainment, had the most stable economy, the lowest unemployment. Tunisia was a success story. Mm-hmm. It was the most homogeneous country in terms of ethnicity and race and all of the other variables that very often contribute to divisive politics. And yet it exploded because it had a very corrupt leader and families and cronies, and it became known. And then one day, a fruit vendor in the interior of the country just immolated himself because of the way he was being treated, and that sparked the whole Arab Spring. So explaining that in terms of just social media on the internet is very truncated. My explanation instead is that there is a variety of forces that, in order to simplify my understanding of them, I put in three categories that I called the more revolution, the mobility revolution, and the mentality revolution. And so the more revolution is that we live in an age of profusion. We live in an age of abundance. There is just more of everything, starting with people. The world increased by 2 billion people just in 20 years. We now grow in a decade what we used to grow in a century in terms of population. And the more people that we have is not just more, but they are better off in general, on average. As you well know, poverty has been declining. Global GDP today is 5 times larger than it was in 1950. Per capita GDP is 3.5 times, 3.5 times larger than it used to be. According to the World Bank, in the last 2 decades, 28 countries are no longer low-income countries. They shifted in their categories from low-income to middle-income. According to the ILO, the International Labour Organization, 38,000 workers per day are lifted out of poverty in the last decade. So we have more people. They are relatively better in terms of material situation. But we also have more guns and more medicines, more computers and more airplanes, more cargo containers and more everything. Touch any statistic and compare that statistic in volume in the last 20 years, and you will be amazed at the booming, skyrocketing rates of growth of everything. What does that have to do with power? Well, it is much easier to control a small group of people than a large group of people, obviously. Zbigniew Brzezinski is fond of saying that in these days it's easier to kill 100 million people than to govern 100 million people. So you have more, it's harder to control. That's the more revolution. But this more of everything and more people not only are more, they move more. And that's the mobility revolution. And you know that. And it's just, we have more movement of people and ideas and money and goods and services and illnesses and everything is moving more. And it's not staying in one place, which also has consequences for power. We have, according to the UN, 37% more people living outside the countries. The number remittances for many countries are far more important. The income from remittances of workers, of people, of nationals working abroad for many countries are the main source of revenues. Revenues that go directly from the workers abroad to their families without government intermediation, which also has consequences for power. Recently, a man from Nigeria was elected the mayor of a town outside Dublin. That is just one example of many that are having consequences. Obama's last election, and the last election in the United States, as you know, had a lot to do with the presence and the voting patterns of Hispanics. So these are people that are on the move, and so that's the mobility revolution. And the third is the mentality revolution. When you have a decade or two of this, there are patterns that we're seeing in terms of changes in aspiration, expectations, motivations, and ambitions. And patterns of behaviors are changing. There are some striking anecdotes and some striking statistics. One striking anecdote to me is that the rates of divorce rates in India among the elderly are skyrocketing. So and mostly driven by women. So Indian old senior citizens, women, are just getting out of marriages. Many of them arranged marriages. People were married 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they're not taking it anymore, and they're walking away. Why? Well, because of the three revolutions. They are more empowered. They have their more material well-being. They're better informed. They have the option to do it that they didn't have it in the past. And that kind of anecdote is corroborated by all kinds of evidence. The worldwide, the World Values Survey, it's a fantastic enterprise that has started 3 or 4 decades ago that goes around the world. Hundreds of countries, same questions about people's opinions, expectations. And we see a global trend in which there is far more commitment and expectation of individual freedoms, of ability to decide on your own life, resistance to authoritarian impositions, and even gender rights are moving in the direction of more equality. And so there's 3 revolutions. You put them together, you shake them, and you create what I call the decline of power.
Well, let me try and tease out a consequence of a couple of things. You talk in the book about, you make a particular focus on middle classes across the world, both in growing low and middle income countries and in perhaps stagnating or declining high income countries. And you talk about the effect of the more and the mobility revolutions, and you could have drawn on the mentality revolution as well, on middle classes in particular. And at least when I read that, it struck me as an important part of what I saw in what I saw firsthand in South Africa and in Northern Ireland, in transitions there that were ascribed to long-term struggles, but in many ways the moment of change when you were really there on the ground, the desire of middle classes in South Africa, a tiny but aspiring black middle class and a large and growing white middle class that just wasn't interested in the struggle about apartheid on the white side anymore, and the desire to move, to partake in a world culture was at least a powerful part, I think, of that change. You could make the same analysis that was at play in Northern Ireland, and I don't know the situation. My colleagues know it better in Burma today. But my hunch is these movements that you're talking about are part of changes in power, the loss of the apartheid regime, the loss of both sides in the struggle in Northern Ireland, and perhaps the loss of the military grip on even the generals in Burma. What is the cost? Those three examples make me think, well, bring it on. You know, this loss of power is a pretty good thing. If we got mobility and we got more and we got mentality and people are shaking off oppressive regimes, why should we be worried about this? What makes you nervous about the decay of power?
So, first, I'm with you in celebrating that power is changing in the way it does. It gives us, as consumers, as voters, as citizens, it gives us more options, less restrictions, more opportunities, and so plenty to celebrate, to applaud, and as you say, bring it in. We like it. Bring it on. And so, good. But then it has some elements that deserve our concern. Think about sequesters in the United States. Think about the Italian election. Think about the inability of the world to stop the carnage in Syria. Think about the incapacity of the European Union to stop or do something about the economic crisis. Think about the inability of the world to really do something effective about climate change and global warming. To me, and I can continue with infinite examples, to me, all of those are instances in which the decline of power is at work, in which we have worked our way to a world in which in too many critical situations, we have enough actors with just enough power to veto and block the initiatives of rivals and others, but no one with enough power to impose a view. And so we are living in a world of vetoes in many, many instances. Of the 34 countries that are members of the OECD, the rich countries group, only 4 have a head of state that has the support of parliament, meaning that his political party is also in control of the parliament or Congress of the National Assembly. 4 out of 34, meaning that in 30 of the largest democracies in the world, there is a division and there is the executive and the legislative are at odds, are in opposition, which is a good thing if that's part of the checks and balances of democracy, and we welcome that, and that's good. Except that in many countries, they are now choking on checks and balances. The good, positive effects of checks and balances on governance, on democracy, are in some instances creating the contrary effect of inability to make decisions, dilutions of decisions, meaning, in order to arrive at something that you can do, you have to reach for a minimum common denominator that very often is not good enough to solve the problem. And other times, the timeliness, the decisions are just, these problems and these crises are just need urgent action that because of the world of vetoes, they just take too damn long.
Can you say, so I think there's a way of hearing what you're saying, that power is useful at times to do things, and the fact that power can also be oppressive and people are feeling better at getting over it means they're actually getting over it more than is good for us, and we ought to hold on to some. But there's a way of that can begin to sound to play off a kind of resistance movement or some of what protest movements do versus people who hold power. You also talk, you have a phrase in the book, I'm not going to pronounce it right, the banalization of social movements. So it's not just that people with great power are losing the concentrated ability to impose their will. You also think something is happening to the kind of social movements that many parts of the Open Society foundations are counting on to be checks on oppressive power. What do you mean? What does that phrase mean, and what's happening to social movements?
They're thriving and doing quite well. And in the last 2 decades have been great for social movements, for NGOs, and have been terrible for political parties. And I think that's bad. And in the book, I make a big appeal to bring back political parties. Not the ones we know now, but political parties that I hope will be better and more modern and more alluring. And the example that I am fond of using is when I talk to university students, I ask them, how many of you, there is this butterfly in Indonesia that is endangered. How many of you could help me? Let's do something. Let's mobilize time and energy and raise money to save this butterfly in Indonesia. Typically, in university settings, you see a lot of, yes, I'm going to help you. Let's do that. Then ask that same group, would you like to join the political party with me? Would you want to be? And they rush to the door. They want to hear about that. And in fact, it's not cool to be a member of a political party, the Republicans or the Democrats, or in any of the countries. So political parties have lost a lot of appeal. And they're not that competitive in terms of attracting the energies and the potential of the best and the brightest and the young and energetic. And so I think that's bad, and I think that needs to be changed. I believe that democracy based on social movements is not good. I believe that democracy needs political parties, mostly because a lot of the social movements tend to be single issue movements. And you can afford to just have some tunnel vision that says, all I care about is the environment. And kindergarten education, I don't care, and incarceration rates, and I don't care, nor I care about exchange rate, or monetary policy, or nuclear weapons. All I care is the environment, or whales, or, and well, that's a luxury. Because if you are in government, you have to have an opinion and you have to care about kindergarten education and nuclear weapons and agriculture and finance and war and multilateral organizations and a whole panoply of things. And very often you discover that in government the choices are never between the wonderful and the horrible. In government, very often, most of the time, the decisions and the choices are between the horrible and the really, really horrible. That is an education that if you listen to some of the debates that are out in the streets, you would think that the world is divided between idiots that make horrible decisions and the idealists that have the solution and they're ignored. And that's,
So, but not all political parties are doing badly. I was just in Athens recently, and Golden Dawn seems to be growing in popularity. And in the book, you talk about actually the rise of parties on the far left and the far right as part of the decline in power or the decay of power. How does one entail the other?
Well, if you look at, I have looked at the agendas of the powers that are, the political parties that are doing well. You said we may be mentioning Venezuela. The PSUV, the political party of President Chavez, is doing quite well. Mm-hmm. And in Europe, a lot of the political parties that reflect anti-immigrant, isolationist, and nationalist tendencies are also doing quite well. Golden Dawn is doing quite well, and so on. Mm-hmm. That's not the kind of political parties I want to see. And I like to use the example of, I hope that political parties can examine and learn and understand better what happened and perhaps even emulate in some aspects what happened to Al-Qaeda and what happened to the Occupy Wall Street movement. Of course, I'm not suggesting that you have to train your followers to immolate them, and kill and be assassins. But certainly Al-Qaeda had something in terms of their ability to motivate, recruit, attract, retain, and make people do horrible things. Well, how do they do that? I'm far from me to suggest that political parties have to look like cults or have to have deeply, religious kinds of narratives in order to attract and energize people. But surely something is going on, or used to, and now it's much weakened, but there's something there. And the same with Occupy Wall Street. How did it happen that all of a sudden in 2,600 cities around the world, you had people camping in the squares with a very similar structure? It was leaderless, they communicated more or less in the same ways, they had the same agenda of requests and protests. A lot of the Occupy Wall Street ended up as a cathartic movement where just nothing happened. In some cases, they did have some influence. But again, what is it that they have that some political parties could emulate? And I think learning and studying that is part of the political innovation that the world desperately needs.
I want to come back to that in a minute, but since you brought up Venezuela, let me just seize the moment to ask you. So does the book mean that Maduro will lose power quickly?
President Maduro is likely to be the next president of Venezuela. He is now the vice president, or the president, the acting president. He's going to preside over a deeply, deeply contradictory, hard to understand, and divided country. As we are now here, there are essentially millions in Venezuela that are mourning the death of President Chavez, that feel a deep attachment to him, that feel that he was a father figure, that he was one of them, that had their back protected, that for the first time they had someone like them in charge and making sure that their well-being and those of their families was paramount in the ways in which the state behaved. So there are millions that are just beloving and mourning the loss of these great leaders. But there are also millions, according to the last election, he had 55% of the country loving him and 45% of the country not wanting him in power. In a country that is very poor in general, to get 45% of the votes means that you have to have millions of very poor people with you. That means that millions of very poor people are not with President Chavez. And the explanation is complex, but at the same time, in the last, Venezuela had a very big decline in its inequality, which is quite a success in a region where Latin America, where inequality is one of the worst in the world. So President Chavez was successful in bringing down inequality. He was successful in bringing down poverty and inclusion and empowering people that had not been empowered. And he was, one of his great, very good legacies is that he brought front and center the poor and the plight of the poor and the peaceful coexistence that in Venezuela existed with inequality, exclusion, and poverty is gone. Poverty and inequality is the center of the national conversation. And he was very good at exporting that idea. But at the same time, that the glass is half full, but the glass is also half empty. This is a country that had let me give you this very interesting anecdote. Oil, essentially it's impossible to think about Venezuela without thinking about oil and the impact of oil. The day President Chavez was elected for the first time in 1998, according to the statistical series of oil prices for Venezuela, that day international oil prices for Venezuela were at the lowest in its history. And they have been coming down for almost 2 decades. From the 80s to the 90s, when he got elected, oil prices were deeply depressed. A few months after he got elected, oil was trading, the Venezuelan basket of oil exports was $736 per barrel. A few months later, oil started climbing, and the average for his tenure is oil at $100 per barrel. So he had a windfall of money that was, that he could use. And he had a blank check on the part of the Venezuelan population to say, do whatever needs to be done to change the country and improve it. So he had a political blank check, and he had a financial blank check given by oil markets. And here we are 14 years later, in which Venezuela has the slowest rate of growth in Latin America in the last 5 years, has the highest, one of the highest inflations in the world, the highest inflation of the world after Zimbabwe. It has the highest, is the sixth country in the world in terms of murder rates. It's one of the most murderous countries and most dangerous countries in the world today. It is much more risky to walk the streets of Caracas than to walk the streets of Kabul or any of the dangerous cities in the world. In the most recent war in Gaza, during that period, the number of people that were killed in Venezuela was 3 times larger than the number of casualties and victims in that war. Venezuela, in rankings, in 100, there's one of the rankings, 144 countries are studied in terms of the quality of the judicial system. Venezuela ranks 144 today. Haiti, according to these rankings, has a better, more reliable judicial system than Venezuela. Venezuela ranks 120th in terms of infrastructure. Ethiopia and Gabon rank higher than Venezuela in terms of quality of infrastructure. In terms of, there's an index of the efficiency of goods markets. Venezuela ranks at the bottom. There is an index about shortages. You measure availability of basic goods and staples in shelves in grocery stores. This is a study by a United Nations agency. Venezuela's indexes of shortages are those that you commonly find in a war zone. And this is a country that had almost about $1.4 trillion worth of revenues during the Chavez era. So that's where we are. And one of the most distorted economies in the world in terms of pick any variable, the monetary policy, exchange rates, fiscal, pick any variable, and that variable will soon need to be adjusted. And you know what that means. That means a lot of popular pain, and President Maduro will need to explain why, when El Comandante was in charge, life was so much better, and why under President Maduro things are not going that well. And
so I want to try and connect the Venezuela analysis to the book a little bit, because if I apply what you say in the book, I shouldn't worry about whether Marulo is up or someone else is up. One of the lessons you say is to look in the long term and stop worrying about who's up and who's down in the short term, because power, even if you're up, you won't be up for as long as you used to be. The second point that you've been talking about already is the point about political parties. And so perhaps, and this is really a question, part of your prescription might be to build political parties in Venezuela. Now, presumably the opposition coalition was trying to do that last time. But are coalitions a way to do that, or will it just go the way of other power and fragment? What in short is to be done if you apply, if we have this insight about power, we have a situation, whether it's Venezuela or any in the world, how does understanding what's happening to power now help us figure out what to do?
Perhaps the most important statistic to answer that is in today's world, there are 22 countries that are autocracies, down from 89 in 1977. And here the OSF certainly played a role, an important role. So this is not a good time to be a dictator and an autocrat. And you can see how even the autocrats go out of their way to find ways to build a patina of democratic legitimacy and credibility. I wonder at the extent to which Mr. Putin goes out of his way to have elections and have everything that makes him look like a Democrat. And then we all know what's really going on. So you ask yourself, why? Why does he do that? And my answer is, 20, 30 years ago, he wouldn't. And now he feels that he needs to do it in order to be part of the, to have everything that the world is not longer that tolerant with autocracies. And, we still have 22 of those, but it's harder to keep them, and it's not easy. And applying it to the specificity of Venezuela, I would only caution that to think about Venezuela in terms of a democracy may not be the best way to think about it. In terms of, when you think, well, there's a political party that is in government, and then there is an opposition that is trying, to oust the incumbent, and that's the way we think about the democracy. Except that that's not the case. The opposition in Venezuela is not running against a political party. It's running against a petrostate that is not shy away from using all of the resources of the state to stay in power. They massively use government money and government workers and government resources of all kinds, and government incentives and sticks and carrots to make sure that elections go their way. And they have all the levers of power in their control. The National Assembly is controlled from the presidential palace, and we have evidence of that. The judicial system is also an appendix of the government, and we have seen President Chavez, when he was alive, on television dictating rulings for the judges. Says, I want this to happen. And lo and behold, the next day, a judge made the decision exactly in the way that President Chavez wanted it to be. The National Electoral Council, which is the arbiter of elections, is also an appendix. Most recently, the president of the Electoral Council, after an election in which President Chavez won again, was rewarded. With what? With the vice presidency. So just imagine the guy that is in charge of being the arbiter of your electoral decision. If it goes your way, the guy becomes the vice president of the country. So that are just some of the elements that illustrate the kind of political system you have there, and why thinking about it in traditional categories of democracies and electoral politics may not capture what really is happening in the country.
I listen to you, and I think actually what's going on is power may not be what it used to be, but clever people do know how to hold on to it. And I want to, before we open it up, I just want to ask one more question and go back to the point about political parties, because a lot of your prescription at the end of the book really comes down to an investment in restoring trust in government, restoring active citizen participation, and participation particularly in political parties. In that section of the book, you talk about how just as political parties have been declining in popularity and power, NGOs have been growing. You almost suggest there's almost a direct trade-off, which would be music to the ears of most of my colleagues in the room with us. We've worked very hard for that, and you want to reverse it. So I want to know why. There's an idea there that somehow political parties need to look more like NGOs, or at least feel to citizens more like NGOs, and that's the model. I have two questions about that. One is, you talked about how NGOs, you wouldn't want a government by at least some kinds of NGOs or social movements. And if political parties become more like that, to try to appeal to citizens, feel them engaged, might not they just reproduce the very thing you worry about in the trend of NGOs? Related to that, I want to ask, we don't feel here so triumphant about the place of NGOs in the world. We're looking at it's not just Russia and Egypt that are attacking NGOs, charging them with criminal penalties, threatening to shut them down, passing more and more restrictive laws. Those laws are the South African government and others, the governments celebrated as clear democracies are cracking down, as it were, or at least putting pressure on NGOs, particularly around international funding of NGOs. So in many ways, we look at the world and see power fighting back in a way against the picture of NGOs you depict. So how do I make sense of this, both your sense that NGOs are really triumphant in the world today, and what would political parties, do you really want them learning the lessons and acting like the very NGOs you distrust?
That's a great question. So the immediate reaction is, by no means I'm suggesting that authoritarian governments have disappeared or are weak or incapable of being repressive. And we have seen that. And what's very interesting is to see against whom they are being repressive. And in most cases, they are being targeting the ones that are successful. Mm-hmm. So one measure to gauge the success of NGOs, and by that, but NGOs, let's be specific, you're talking about NGOs that promote protection of human rights, freedom of the press, and the political specter mm-hmm. Of NGOs, because you also have the social NGOs, the ones mm-hmm. that fight for poverty alleviation, and there is connection there, but be that, let's use that category for a second. So it tells you something that when these governments are targeting these NGOs, that's because they feel threatened by them. That's because they feel that they have something that may become important. And it's going to be with us. I am not at all suggesting that these autocracies are going to explode out of existence. Mm-hmm. They're going to be there, and they're pushing back. And power is very addictive, and there are a lot of barriers to exit of power. It's very dangerous in some places to have been in power and no longer be in power. It used to be that if you're a dictator, if you stop being a dictator, you ended up in Europe, in the south of France, in a palace. Now you end in Europe, but not in the south of France, but in The Hague, in the criminal court. So, it's dangerous to be a dictator, but it's even more dangerous to be a former dictator. And that creates the mousetrap effect, in which you are there and you're not going to get out. Look at Bashar al-Assad. He's not going to, for him it's very, very dangerous and they're going to cling to it, and they're going to do whatever it takes. My point is that they are under more pressures than in the past, that they are more constrained in what they can do than they were, and that the future doesn't bode well for them.
Let's open it up to any comments, or do we think we have a microphone here? Let's just take it right down, right there.
Thank you. It's such a great pleasure to listen to you. I followed your articles and books before.
Can you just tell us who you are?
My name is Juan Carlos Quiroz. I work for the Revenue Watch Institute, which is sort of a satellite.
Part of the family.
Yeah,
right.
Part of the OSI. So my question is what's your take on how all these changes have also empowered organizations that used to have less means for power, and I'm thinking of illicit organizations, organized crime, narcotics in particular. I think that your three revolutions have one of their consequences of having a more affluent society, also more progressive mentality, and just mobility have empowered drug cartels that are just undermining the societies and states in Latin America. What's your take on all these and how your analysis of the decay of power interacts with these sort of factors?
So the book, The End of Power, has its genesis in very personal experiences that led me to start thinking about that and sniffing around. The first personal experience was when I was in government, and people would come and ask me to do certain things, and I would look at them and say, "This guy, really crazy, government, I cannot do that." And at the time, I was one of the powerful ministers in my government. Then I went to the World Bank, and I was in the board of the World Bank, and I had that was a very educational experience, because I had to work with governments from around the world. And you will sit with them and try to sort out what was needed in order to move things forward and reform things. And you will suggest sometimes that they do things, and they will look at you and say, he really doesn't know what he's talking about. There's no way I can do that. That started giving me a strong sense of how limited is government very often in what they can do. And then I wrote a book about, that Chris mentioned, about the globalization of crime. And I looked at the international trade in all of the bad things, from human beings to drugs to weapons to human organs to industrial waste, a long list of things. And when I ended that book, one of the most striking and powerful messages was how limited we were, both governments and civil society, in containing these global networks, global criminal networks. And that gave another layer to my intuitions about what was happening to power. And so the next stage of that is that Foreign Affairs magazine asked me to write an update about what had happened to illicit the criminal activities since I last wrote about them. And I started thinking and talking, and then I wrote an article titled Mafia States. And the central theme of that article is that it's no longer the case that criminals influence governments or certain government agencies. They bribe or extort or do things to the head of customs in order that that person looks the other way when some cargo containers go by. What I think is happening today is that governments are becoming criminal enterprises, and that they take over criminal enterprises, not to stamp them out, but to run them. And I think we have examples of governments in which the top level of that government is effectively a criminal enterprise.
Is that we'll come back here in just one second, but is that new? I haven't, in some ways, isn't.
That's a great. No, you're right. You're right. It's not new, but my point is that it has become, in the same way that inequality is not new. I think it has acquired new characteristics that we need to understand. But you're right.
Oh. Yes, we'll come back here. We got a microphone there, and then we'll bring it down here. Yeah.
Sure. You talked about.
Just tell us who you are.
Malcolm Arnold. You talked about as far as the role of NGOs, as far as the number of NGOs, and wanting to see them decline. And you look at, let's say, what's going on in Uganda with NGOs there promoting anti-LGBT, message, and how that NGOs around the world, how they distort the environment, whether that would be sociological, economic, etc., the role of that. And as in the documentary recently released, Gatekeepers, one of the heads of Shin Bet said, one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, or vice versa. So the role of NGOs, where do you see that as a role, and then partnering with the state, as you say, the state's becoming mafia? Do you then go down the path where you become an anti-statist, and where do you see the role of NGOs in the equation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me give you another example to I follow the thing in Uganda and other places in Africa in which you have this new conversation about equality and to gay, lesbian, and transgender. But let me give you another. So there is essentially, you could talk about the globalization of issues thanks to NGOs, right? That's that's part of the story. But there is another part of that story, another example that I think is very illustrative, and that is the National Rifle Association, which is also exporting its agenda to other countries. And we have there are some fantastic examples. I don't know if you know that the NRA has a full-time team working at the UN that tracks and monitors any initiatives that have to do with you know, gun control issues that they care about. And it was fantastic to see. In Brazil, they had an initiative to ban handguns, and essentially driven by the mothers of victims, of people who were assassinated. And they passed a resolution in order to have a referendum about that. And the surveys indicated that the referendum was going to win. And there was going to be a ban on handguns and stricter gun control regulations. And all of a sudden, about 3 weeks before the referendum, there was an explosion of advertising against it that nobody knew where it came from. And essentially, it was a very well structured, a very well organized campaign that mobilized people against it, and the referendum lost. And then it was discovered that it had been funded by the NRA in the United States. So these are two examples of NGOs exporting and globalizing issues that are in fact very local. And both have to do with the state, if you think. They both have to do with changing rules and legislation and very important things. So the question was, are we becoming statist, or are we becoming an anti-state kind of, is this an anti-state message? No, I think if I have a message, is a message that we need a smarter, stronger state and more autonomous state. And my worry is what I repeatedly talk about, which is a state choked by checks and balances that we applaud, and they are the essence of Jeffersonian democracy, and we want that, and we want to curb power, and we know that absolute power corrupts absolutely, so we don't want that. We want to fight against the concentration of power. But my point is that in some instances we're getting to extremes that are not good for society.
Let's come down here. Oh, Lenny, thank you.
I'll take it after you.
Tanya Milic, could you tell me if there are any places where you think what you hope would happen is happening? Maybe perhaps Scandinavia, any place. I throw Scandinavia out, but certainly in the United States is not one of those places.
Well, let's define what is it that I want to happen, and where is it happening. We talked about a wide range of things, and let's concentrate on I guess, on the government part of it. And the Scandinavians are also the feel-good example. Whenever there's something horrible, you say, well, but in Scandinavia they do it differently and it works.
I almost didn't say that, but that was the only place I could think of.
Yeah, no, but you, by the way, I think you're right. And if I had to pick, but even there, you see events. You see what happened in Iceland when the financial crisis hit, and how they processed that politically, and the power shifts that took place there. But mostly I am very hesitant to use patterns, because I think initial conditions matter. And the initial conditions and the basic conditions in Scandinavia are so uniquely Scandinavian that I'm wary of imagining that you could go to Norway or to Sweden and make the list of conditions there, and then go to South Africa and say, well, let's do that here. One has to be very, very respectful of local conditions and beware from easy exporting. But you are right, that's a right question in terms of looking around for models of success that can be emulated.
Lenny.
Thank you very much, Lenny Bernardo. Moises Naim, thank you for a very interesting conversation with Chris. I was struck by one particular thing. You have, on the one hand, a fairly provocative analysis of power constrained, the sort of mutation of power, but your prescription, what needs to be done, is very modest. And I'm trying to square the two, because when you spoke about the Tunisia example, it struck me as a combination of sort of modernization theory come global interdependence ideas, very traditional. You know, that fewer people practice religion, divorce rates are higher, the middle class is growing, straight modernization theory. Which is fine, but I wondered if there was something a little bit more provocative about your description. Chris focused on the political party question, which I also found surprisingly traditional for an analysis that was this, in some ways, radical, and that one need not counterpose, as you do, political parties and social movements. There are middle grounds. It doesn't have to be representative democracy or social movements. There are forms of participatory democracy as well that could fall into an analysis of this sort. So I'm wondering about this disjuncture between a radical analysis about, in some ways, the diminution of power and a kind of traditional prescription around it.
That's a very insightful question. And the way to answer it candidly is that it has to do with what brings a book to an end. And there is an intellectual answer, and there is a biological answer. So the intellectual answer is that you close the book when you feel that you have made the argument, and then you round it up and you have a conclusion. And the more real answer, I think, has to be a book is finished when you cannot, you're sick of it. And that you're exhausted and you don't want to know anymore. And that was, very candidly, that was my case. And I accept that my prescriptive ending is not as all-encompassing and all of, you know, it should be. That requires, frankly, another book that I was, at the time in which I was closing this book, I was not in the mood of writing. Having said that, however, in a humble defense of the conclusion, is that I believe that the conclusion is, the implications are larger than to say, therefore, these are the 5 things that need to be done. You know, I think this is beyond the PowerPoint, and therefore, this is my consultant type of approach, and these are the 5 prescriptions for you. First, because I don't have them. Second, because I am very humble in terms of being very respectful of what's going on. And then finally, there is an element of modernization theory, but this is modernization theory on steroids. What's going on here and what I try to describe in the book, I think transcends the typical notions that we have seen in terms of modernization theory or, you know, structural functional analysis of all that. I think there's something going on that we don't have the intellectual tools to fully comprehend. And that's why it's so hard then to move swiftly to very bold. All I know is that I have identified a situation that is taking us to a place that dramatically, urgently needs something to be done. And I hint at some of the arenas. But to be the most sincere thing I can tell you is that it had to do more with my own mood and biology more than the intellectual resolutions.
So now that it's been a few months since you put the book down, and maybe we can entice you into a conversation about the other side of that. So let me follow on that question, because it seemed to me and we've talked a little bit about this before. One of the things that I was worried about in your focus on political parties was spending a lot of time in South Africa, where the ANC looks like exactly what you're calling for. They've learned a lot of lessons from NGOs. A lot of them spent their lives in NGOs. It's very, very popular. People are very engaged. And it has a grip on power in South Africa that is impressive if one is impressed by power. There have been a series of efforts to try and shake it, and it seems to survive remarkable scandal, splinters, attacks from its own heroes, a range of things, constitutional judgments, a range
corruption.
Corruption. And it seems to me that it's very hard if you start trying to figure out how to start from political parties. And it seems to me your analysis about the power of Occupy Wall Street or or just take your point about NGOs, isn't that a better starting place rather than worrying about the narrowness or the banality of some of those movements and some of those NGOs? Wouldn't it be better to start there and try and build the kind of political maturity that you're calling for, rather than ask what feels like the old structures to learn something from these upstarts, but not let them get a hand on the levers of power and keep it for themselves? There's a sense in which you've sort of seen the future, and then instead of embracing it or maturing it, you want to hold it back while the past learns the lesson of it and tries to have another go at global governance or at national governance or at corporate governance.
I think, Chris, that one of the difficulties we have in the conversation is the use of the concept of NGO. And you know better than I that now that comes to encompass such a variety, is a category that has and captures such a diversity and such a variety of experiences, initiatives, organizational forms and agendas, that it's hard to just say, well, NGOs. And I am guilty, perhaps, of having presented political parties in a Manichaean way, political parties and NGOs, and so I want more political parties, which by default, I didn't say it, by default can be interpreted as saying I want less NGOs. That's not at all what I'm saying. And in fact, NGOs have provided, they are the breeding ground of a lot of people in government. And a lot of people that end up being in cabinets come not from political parties, but are coming from NGOs and think tanks and that kind of thing. That was my own personal experience even. So not at all I'm saying that, you know, NGOs have to be shrinked or are not important or do not perform a useful job. All I'm saying is that in the last 20 years, the playing field has been very, very skewed against political parties. That's all I'm saying. And yes, this is not an appeal to shrink or stop or curb the expansion and the support of NGOs is just pay attention to the need to strengthen political parties, which is not part of the usual conversation. We could have had this conversation without ever mentioning political parties.
Right. Yes, go. I can always count on you. This is great.
My question is, you yourself in a position of power, and do you feel like it's declining in recent years, the power of your position?
Just introduce yourself.
My name is Dasha. I work for the Open Society Foundations. And the second question, would you imagine giving up your power? And what would that mean? And what would be the occasion or the cause for that, if you ever imagine?
The power of my position sounds like huge, but not from where I stand. I don't run an organization. I don't have a budget. I don't have people working for me, or at least, you know, I just have very competent assistant, but I don't have a bureaucracy. So when you ascribe power to me, I'm in the board of OSF, but that's not a powerful position. I do whatever he tells me to do. And so no, I have a hard time relating to the notion that I am powerful. I do write a column that it's widely syndicated, and perhaps my ideas are spread around the world, but I have no evidence that you know. So I have a hard time relating to that. I don't feel, you know, there are far more powerful people in the world than I.
Do you miss being minister?
No. Well, yes.
All right.
Yes, that's yeah. But even there, you know, that's You want me to say more?
No, it's okay. Even there, you're
I'm ready.
yeah,
If
yeah,
someone
yeah,
has an
yeah.
offer, I'm listening. Regardless of the country, I'm available.
Tom, just introduce yourself.
Sorry. Tom Kellogg, Open Society Foundations. I run the China program, and my question is about China. I was relieved in hearing this talk. I saw the title of the talk. I'm sorry I haven't read the book yet. And I thought this would be yet another talk of which I am professionally obligated to go to a lot, in which China is coming and it is going to be the new world power. And that is not a view that I share. And I see you shaking your head, so I see that you also do not share that view. Since you're now only interested in unpowerful positions, maybe you could be the next leader of China. But my question is, how do you see China in the picture of the ideas that you develop in the book? Thank you.
Yeah, well, yes, I am baffled and surprised by the obsession about the elevator conversation. You know, who's up, who's down, and China is coming and the United States is going. You know, the declinist debate makes me sick, and I think is intellectually very fragile and not that interesting. Of course, and you know, the people counting the minutes to when China's GDP is going to be larger than the United States is also what I think is an intellectual semi-fraudulent conversation. China continues to be a very poor place with huge limitations that is going to face massive challenges ahead. And of course, is going today, you know, how to deny that China today is so much more powerful than it used to be. But the way to think about that and the Sino-American relationship is not, you know, who's up and who's down and thinking in traditional power plays, the old geopolitics, you know, the Bismarckian kind of power plays. I do believe that the three revolutions are fast and hard at work in China. I believe that everything that I described in the three revolutions has China as a paradigmatic example. And I do believe China is going to face very important pressures to democratize and so on. And where Chris was mentioning before the role of the middle class as a force for change, the middle class can also be a very important obstacle to change. I can imagine a middle class in China very fearful of chaos, and a middle class that says, yes, you know, they are authoritarians and they limit a lot of things that I could do in the political realm, but they're giving me and my family opportunities that I have never had. And let's not shake the, you know, let's make sure that things continue. And therefore you can imagine that there is a middle class that is going to be against profound political change in China. But also at the same time, you can see or imagine a middle class that is aspirational and that wants more. And that after they have been given more material well-being and more goods essentially, they will want more services. And by that I mean health and education and so on. So in China, as in many other places, it's easier to build a building and call it a hospital than provide health care. So once they have a hospital in the neighborhood that they didn't have before, next thing they want is the hospital to provide good health care. And if they don't get it, they're going to take to the streets. And you know better than I that the number of street incidents in China is by the hundreds, thousands. You know, in a single day in China, you go out, and the probability that are people in the streets clashing with the riot police is very high for a variety of reasons. And I think that's going to continue. So imagining that a country facing those challenges will become, you know, a challenger to the United States and others, I think it's not an interesting conversation to me.
I hope you're saying these things in Washington, because that's not the tone of the conversation right now.
I know, but the book is just out.
Yeah.
Hi, Sanjay Patil with Open Society Foundations. I mean, power is a very complicated word, and I think people may mean different things when they use that word power. So my question is maybe slightly existential. But what I want to ask is, we often don't hear much about the reasons for why people seek power in the first place, the motivations for acquiring power. In my mind, I feel like a lot of it is ego-driven, and even if the intention to acquire power is for quote-unquote good reasons, I still feel a lot of it is ego-driven. They say that you can't run for president of the United States without having a healthy ego. So even if you feel like you're doing it for the right reasons, a lot of the impetus for seeking and acquiring power is ego-driven. And I was wondering, A, whether you agree with that, and B, it strikes me that there's very few secular attempts to unpack this question of why people seek power, the ego component to it, teasing out, if you look at, say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and if we agree that self-actualization is at the peak, is this a gap of work that, say, OSF or other donors work on, that we're not focusing on the reasons for why people seek power in the first place? Because that motivation often translates into control, issues of domination, issues of oppression.
That's a very sophisticated and complex question. So there's a whole chapter in the book in which I try to answer, there's a brief history of power and what it means, and different, as you said, there are different ways of interpreting power and everything else. Let me just start by suggesting that implicit in what you're saying and equating power, the drive towards power, to a healthy ego, as I suspect that you're talking and thinking about political power. But there is power in families. You have a power in many ways. You have a power relationship with your parents and your siblings and your spouse or your and so on. No? So there are, and then there is there are power relationships inside OSF, and so power is part, and that you cannot argue that it's just driven by ego, right? There are maybe. And to support that, I can point to you to recent research with brain imaging with toddlers. There is a whole new way of looking at power that says that power is wired in our brains. That is a very deep, profound, innate urge, and that and then it's controversial, but it's there, and there are brain imaging preliminary evidence in that respect from very early, very early stages of human evolution, of the development, and from a developmental perspective. And so let me just divide, moving now to the realm of power in politics and everything else. Let me just parse what you call healthy ego with narcissism. Narcissism is not just a metaphor. Narcissism can become psychiatric dysfunctional behavior. In fact, if you go to the DSM-5, which is the book that psychiatrists use to define mental illnesses, there is one that is called narcissistic something disorder, and has the specificities of what is a narcissistic personality. What is very interesting is one of the things when you become very narcissistic, when you in acute manifestations of narcissism, your antennas about others and how to relate with others get muddled. You don't hear, you just listen to yourself, and you just listen to people that are applauding you. You stop listening to people that are not applauding you or even criticizing you. And that's very interesting, because in order to get to have power very often, you need to have a very alluring, very appealing, very attractive personality. And you have to have very good antennas about interpersonal relationships. You have to have a very high emotional intelligence. You have to sniff what the other wants and convey it and scratch whatever need that person, whatever itch that person has. So very developed intuitions about others. Then when you get to have power, somehow having power stifles the functioning of those antennas because people stop listening. And that has consequences for power. A lot of people that lose power lose it because their antennas about how to read the environment are not as good as they were when in their way up to power.
We'll get there. Just
Hello.
do one in the back, and then we'll go over here.
Yeah, thank you for a fascinating exchange. My name is Robert Chacona. In addressing the fluidity of power in Central and Latin America today, given the parameters that you've described, how would you opine on the changing fraternal relationship between Venezuela and Cuba?
Did you ask him to ask that?
Yeah.
To this last description of trying to put out the antennas of what the person, and we're on the same page on that, so I'd really like to hear about that.
One of the, concerning specifically Venezuela, one of the untold stories and fascinating stories and a known story is how this small bankrupt island in the Caribbean ends up controlling the world's the countries with the largest oil reserves. I can understand why they would want to do it. I cannot understand why the Venezuelan government let them. I know there are reasons for that, but there is a big story. The extent to which the Cuban government now runs, not influences, runs very important agencies of the Venezuelan government is quite amazing and quite unknown. And that will continue. And if you compare, the big empires that are trying to shape things, well, Cuba has become a very influential player in this country. And I think that will continue for a while.
And here. Just sorry, right. Just 1 second.
Yeah, I'm Jamila Hetley, and I'm from the Public Health Program at OSF. So if I accept your thesis that power is declining and that this is problematic for the range of reasons that you've suggested, and then if I also jump, I haven't read the book yet, so I'm presenting it as theses. If I also jump to accept that this means that we need to invest in building the relationship between the state and society and political parties, then you're kind of talking about redeeming and repurposing these structures that we've lost faith in for a whole host of reasons. I mean, you pointed to the fact that many states are becoming mafia states and criminalized kind of entities in themselves. Political parties we've lost faith in. This is why your college students walk out of the room. That's a huge task, and I understand that you didn't get in your book to talking about how we're going to do this and thinking about solutions, but I wonder if you have some opinions on where we start. Do we rely on the same NGOs and social movements that you kind of criticize to do this work of making the argument that we need to invest in these structures? Where do you start to begin to move towards the world that you want to see?
Well, I would be very, very happy, and this is a very modest ambition, if at least we start talking about how to bring back political parties. As I said, I could have come here today and give you a talk in which political parties would have never been mentioned. I would have not raised it. I bet you that none of you would have raised it, because they are not part of the way we think about the world today. It's not something that is part of the conversation. The strengthening, modernization, transformation of political parties is not part of the national conversation anywhere. And so if I succeed in making that a little bit more part of the conversation and get smart people like you to start thinking, scratching your head, and first, if you agree, and then if you agree, then well, how do we do this? That's not a bad start. Because again, I very humbly say I don't have the PowerPoint with the 5 bullets on what needs to be done. I do know that it's urgently needed, and I do know that I don't have the answer.
Let me take one more question before we do, let me just follow up on that, if I can, a little bit. We've been talking about the potential for a re-energized and repurposed politics from want of a better phrase, the bottom up. And we've been talking about the political parties, which I think in most of our minds are identified with national states. We don't have, there used to be some visions of some global political parties, but that's not what you're talking about, and that's not what is talked about much anymore. And yet, when I listened to the problems you ticked off, when I said, you know, actually the decline and decay of power might be a good thing, you said, but. The but were all beyond the reach, even of a national state, even if it revived a political party. The problem in Italy is not an Italian politics problem, it's a European problem. The problem in Syria, you said, was not about, you didn't say what's happening in Syria, you talked about why can't the international actors deal with the problem in Syria. And then you talked about climate change. So these are problems on a different scale than political parties as we know them, even if they could be repurposed, are likely to be able to affect, at least unless this happens in many countries at the same time. And yet when I think about new forms of power today, at least I think, and I don't, I think about calling it as powerful might not pass a laugh test, but you mentioned yourself the International Criminal Court. You didn't mention, and I don't think it's in the book, the Global Fund on AIDS, TB, malaria. These are institutions where people are exercising power now in very sophisticated ways across a span we've probably never seen before. At least in these relatively open ways. The International Criminal Court, the Global Fund may not be completely transparent, but compared with General Motors, they're doing pretty well. And so are there forms, are there other sources? You talk about political parties, but what about these new forms of global organization? Do they give us any hope or clues about the kind of new institutions you call for at the end of the book?
I think the most dangerous deficit in the world today is the gap between the need for effective multilateral action and the capacity of the states, of nation states, to act collectively. In globalization and a whole set of other factors, including the 3 revolutions, have created a long list of problems that you correctly mentioned that cannot be tackled by any country acting alone, that escape even the reach and the effectiveness of a big superpower like the United States. And so we have a growing list of challenges that need countries to work together. At the same time, what we have seen is that the ability of the world, of a number of countries, to act together is either stagnant or declining. And that creates a big deficit, a big gap. In economics, when you have huge demand and not enough supply, you end up with inflation. In geopolitics, when that happens, you end with a lot of people killed. And that's why that's the most dangerous deficit. The reason why I place political parties and the need to strengthen national politics is because I am convinced that our stagnation at the global level is a reflection of the inability and the weakness of nation states to strike deals because they don't have a mandate. So if you have a weak national government that has to sit with other weak national governments, the deals that they will strike will not be up to par in terms of solving or making a dent to the global problems we have. And what's happening is that you have these weaklings sitting down at summits that look like they are a convention of the powerful of the world. But then when you see who they are, and if you see even more importantly what they agree, then you see, well, there's no power there. And the reason that there is no power at the international level is because the powerful at the local, at the national level, are not being able to get a mandate from their citizens. in order to reach international deals, very often you need to have compromises, and you have to go back to your voters and explain, for example, why are you going to divert some resources from your urgent, dire needs at home to deal with a problem that looks remote and foreign and distant, and how do you explain that if you are barely surviving for your political life? And so unless we have stronger governments, more secure governments, it's going to be very hard to have a better functioning of the multilateral system. And then in the book I make a big deal of something I call minilateralism, which is trying to do things like the Global Fund and others that do not require the vote of 192 countries, that just do a coalition find. If you look at what are the main problems of the world, and you say, well, which countries are the main players, either as a cause or a solution of this problem, the number will never be more than 20. Very few problems in the world today, the big ones, require more than 20 players. If you get, and the number is more like between 12 and 15. If you get 12 or 15 countries for the big issues to agree and work together, you're gonna get about 80% of the problem. The issue is that the 180 countries that are not invited to the table are going to complain about the democratic deficit and how this is exclusionary, how this reeks of colonialism, how, the whole list of why, we need a global democracy. One country, one vote, even if that one country has 100,000 inhabitants, a population of 100,000 that has as much and that vote counts as much as the vote of India. So that's very problematic, and that's why minilateralism may be the way, one small step in the right direction.
So the next book will have a chapter on the G20, I take it. Yeah. Yes, right here.
My name is Teresa Studinsky, and I am the president of the Global Alliance for Preventive Wings in the Military.
For preventive?
Wings in the Military. It's a non-profit organization. And I was wondering, first of all, I wanted to thank you for a wonderful, wonderful book and presentation and the conversation. And when I think about this, decline of power, and you painted so many variables so widely, that it affects. I was just wondering, do you think, because that when you come to the core of the basic reason why it happens on such a large scale, everywhere, in particular, and on higher levels concerning not only local issues, but also global issues that the gentleman mentioned, do you think when we come to the core of that, isn't it in the inability to cope with the issue of violence and the issue of poverty in a way which would work? I mean, in a kind of predicted way. That behind all this is basically everywhere, locally, and on the higher levels, it's the violence that erupts in every kind of situation, in every way, which is connected with the crime rate. And on the other hand, it's poverty, which is lingering around. And if these two issues are coped with in a, I wouldn't say, some kind of predicted way on a local level and on higher levels, there would be no violence and no poverty. I mean, first of all, what do you think about this? How violence and issue and poverty influence this decrease of power, and what do you think about this as a solution? Thanks.
I think that equating, giving poverty as an explanation for crime is a very dangerous idea. We have very poor countries that are not that violent, and we have very wealthy countries that are very violent. So I disagree that poverty, of course, poverty is always the driver for a lot of things, but declaring that violence and homicide rates are just a function of poverty is a highly paralyzing assumption, because that means, well, there's nothing we can do about crime and violence until poverty is eradicated or deeply abated. And that's a very dangerous idea. I think there's plenty that one can do to deal with crime and homicide rates before we see massive declines in poverty. I am surprised, and one of the crusades I am embarked on is to stop the peaceful coexistence in Latin America with homicide rates. Latin America is the most murderous country, the region in the world. Of the top 6 murder rate, the countries that have the highest murder rates in the world are Honduras, El Salvador, Jamaica, Cote d'Ivoire, Gabon, and Venezuela. So of the 6 top murdering countries, no, Mexico is not in the list. Mexico has very high murder rates in some cities. But again, in terms of homicides per 100,000, the top 6 countries in the world are these. And as you see, of the 6, 4 are in Latin America. And I think that's a priority. I think that this is not just for the government to solve. I think this has to be, there should be a mobilization of society. The media and intellectuals and universities and labor unions and the church and governments and everyone has to, and I hope that one day we can have something like a millennium goal type approach in which, we're not going to eliminate homicide, but we can drop, we can do things in which murder rates are declined by 50% in the next 5 years. That's not an unreasonable goal if you make it as the top priority for society. That when presidents meet in summits and don't talk about that, you just shame them into neglecting to talk about the problem that is killing plenty of their citizens, very often the most vulnerable of their citizens. And I think that's achievable, and I think that's one of the things that we ought to be doing.
We're going to leave it there. I want to thank you hugely for this talk, for the book, and for the promise of the next book. One of the things we do with the Open Society Foundations is try to work with people who feel excluded from power, who are on the margins of society, who are oppressed in various ways, and try to remove the obstacles that prevent them from feeling their own power in their societies. When that begins to work, it often takes the form of stopping a national government, stopping a corporation, stopping a land grab, stopping the loss of a local treasure. And I think your call is to take that, to recognize that power can actually be channeled in ways beyond that can be a constructive use of that power, and maybe a hope that if we assemble power differently, maybe we can hold on to it. At least it can last long enough to get out of the problems of the endless checks and balances and actually do something about the problems that you list. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.